I'd like to give you a brief introduction, and then, as was said, I'm happy to try to answer the questions that you may have. First of all, the Jewish tradition prizes questions. A questioning mind, a mind that thinks independently, a mind that notes problems, is something which is valuable and prized. The Talmud tells a story of a scholar who came from Babylon to Israel, and his reputation preceded him. The head of the academy in Israel said, when he arrives, put him in the front row. So they did, and the head of the academy gave a lecture. Afterwards, he called over his informant and said, why'd you tell me he was a great scholar? He's no scholar. So they said, why not? He said, because I presented a whole lecture and he didn't raise any objections. If he were a scholar, he'd have been able to raise objections. Rabbi Eger, one of the greatest Jewish thinkers 200 years ago, wrote glosses on the Talmud. Hundreds of times. His entire comment is, see what it says on a page over there, and it needs analysis. Tzarech iyun. In other words, I found a contradiction between this page and that page, and he had no answer. He just raised the contradiction for other people to think about. That's one of the most valuable commentaries on the Talmud, raising contradictions that you might not have noticed. This is applied in elementary education. When we lived in Baltimore, I was teaching university. Our oldest son, who was 8 years old, came home one day, and the teacher in his class had given him a nickel. This was the 1970s. So we asked him, why did you get a nickel? And he said, because I asked the following question. Of course, it was a brilliant question. He's our son. And then I asked him, what answer did your teacher give? He said, the teacher didn't have an answer. Now imagine this happening in front of the class. The child asks, and the teacher says, it's a question, I don't have an answer, here's a nickel. What's the message? Stump the teacher is good business. If you can do that, you'll win points. So the ability to think independently, think critically, and to raise questions is something which the Jewish tradition feels is an important element of Jewish education. Having said that, I want to introduce you to one Jewish idea which most people find challenging, difficult, and explain to you how I think it could be justified. Until about 1,600 years ago, there was a body called the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin was the 71 greatest Jewish scholars, and the Torah indicates and the Talmud codifies that when they give a decision, it's binding. Even if, this is the words of the Talmud now, even if they tell you your right hand is your left hand, or your left hand is your right hand, you have to follow. To most people, that's very difficult to digest. I'm supposed to follow them even if what they say is patently absurd. Aren't all human beings fallible? Yes, they are. Even rabbis? Yes, they are. Even Sanhedrin? Yes, they are. Well, if they are fallible and they tell me something, and I can see for myself that it's absurd, then they made a mistake. And if they made a mistake, why shouldn't I follow what I know to be true? Well, let's see. Let me take a comparison. You're at university, it's the beginning of the semester, you haven't chosen your courses yet, and you're shopping. You're dropping in on lecture or one another lecture to hear what the professor's talking about and to see whether the subject interests you. Walk into a lecture and the professor says, this semester we are going to talk about infinities, plural, larger and smaller. Larger and smaller infinities. How does that sound? Doesn't that sound odd? Bigger and smaller infinities? Infinity means it goes on forever. Are there two forevers, one further away? That just sounds nuts. Now, what do you do when you hear that from a professor? Do you say, well, that's obviously wrong. It's obviously nuts. He's defrauding the university. Why are they paying him a salary to talk this nonsense? Is that the attitude you have? Or do you say, look, he's paid, he's written textbooks, he has a PhD. Maybe there's something here more than I understand. Even though it seems absolutely absurd to me, maybe that's more a statement about me than it is about the subject. It seems absurd to me because maybe I haven't studied the subject. By the way, I used to teach that. It's called transfinite mathematics, and I used to teach it. And anybody with a high school education can understand in 10 minutes how there could be infinities of different sizes. Or another one, drop into another class, and the professor says, in this semester, we're going to be talking about causation, cause and effect. And we will see examples of cause and effect where the effect comes first and the cause comes later. How does that sound? If the effect happened, so then all the things that made it happen have to be there. Otherwise, how did it happen? Of course, the cause has to come first, the effect has to come second. Again, who's this fraud? Why is he talking this nonsense? Throw him out of the university. But still, he's a PhD in physics. He's written books on the subject, employed by the university. Maybe, even though it sounds nuts, maybe there's something in it. And it sounds nuts to me because I haven't studied the subject. Richard Feynman said so. You may have heard of him. He had a Nobel Prize in physics. John Wheeler said so. So it can't be just nuts, even if it sounds nuts. So now, the Torah tells us, the 71 greatest Jewish scholars discuss and debate a subject and give an answer. I hear it and I say, boy, that sounds nuts to me. Emphasis on to me. Sure, because they're revolving geniuses. They know more than I do. They're smarter than I am, have more experience than I do. And it's my lack of education and lack of intelligence which makes it sound as if, to me, it's nuts. Here's a very, very simple example. Thomas says when you step back from silent prayer, not silent, but focused prayer where you don't speak out loud, we speak the words silently. When you step back, you're supposed to bow to the right, to the left, and center. To the right, to the left, and center. Now, maybe you have seen this done, but there are people who take the steps back and then bow like this. And there are other people who take 3 steps back and they bow like this. How are the second people doing that? It says right, left, center. How is he starting? This way. And yeah, that's what the Talmud says. And that's what they do. Answer. Whose right are we talking about? My right? Or his right, the one that I'm facing? It only says right, left, center. It doesn't say whose right. So now, when I start this way, which is my custom, by the way, I'm bowing to his right. Everyone bows right first. Just a question of which right, my right or the one I'm facing's right. All of a sudden, what sounds absolutely absurd, your right hand is your left hand is your right hand, has a very simple explanation. Because you didn't take into account that when you're praying, you're facing another who's facing you, and he has a right and left also. So I think that it is not unreasonable to be told, when you get a decision of the Sanhedrin, if it sounds absurd to you, it's still reasonable to carry it out. If you need contemporary associations, when your doctor tells you to do something, when your investment counselor tells you to do something, when your lawyer tells you to do something, do you evaluate it on your own, or do you follow his expertise? I have met people, usually they're Americans. Americans have certain disabilities, who say, no, I check it out myself. I don't trust anybody. If I have a medical problem, I go on the internet, I gather sources and check up the sources. So fine. Suppose your doctor tells you that if you don't follow his therapy, you're going to be dead in 36 hours. You say, well, I don't care. I'm going to take 3 weeks to work it out on the internet. Probably not. Not if it's a life-threatening disease, where taking 3 weeks to just look it up on the internet will likely cost you your life. Then you say, he's a trained physician, and I'm not, and I trust him. Indeed, I go further than that. I don't want to research my medical condition on the internet. I've got time for that. That's why I pay doctors. I do philosophy because that's what I want to do. I pay them to know medicine so I don't have to do that. And law, and engineering, and auto mechanics. Why would I want to study auto mechanics to fix my car when I want to spend my time on philosophy? So of course I pay people who've learned the expertise and let them take care of these projects. At any rate, I think the proposition that we should follow the Sanhedrin, even when what they tell us seems absurd to us, is no different from following expertise. It's not irresponsible, it's not irrational, it indeed is quite responsible and quite rational, and it is now an idea which I think, though at first hearing sounds quite challenging, quite difficult, now it's an idea which I hope sounds acceptable. Now that's the introduction that I would like to give you, and now the ball is in your court. As your leader here told us, you have expressed to him the fact that there have been questions that you have that haven't been answered, and if I can answer them, I'll be happy to help you.
Okay, so can you please explain to me the Jewish perspective on evolution? I've never got a definitive answer on the Jewish perspective on evolution.
Okay, there are really two issues here. One issue is, can Judaism accept the theory of evolution as true? And the second is, can the Jewish religion make its peace with the facts of evolution minus the theory? And then there's a footnote as to whether evolution as evolution has good evidence for it or not. I probably don't have time to do that today, though it's a very important subject. But let's start with the first two. Understand what the theory of evolution says. The theory of evolution starts with a history of life on the planet. These are the sequences of developments of various aspects of life. And it gives an explanation for it. It gives a causation, a process that brings it about. The process, roughly, with 100 footnotes later, is random variation and selection. You have something that makes copies of itself. It makes very good copies of itself, very accurate, but not perfect. Not perfect. So once in n times, let's pick 1,000 just for the sake of the word. Once in 1,000 times, when it makes a copy, it makes a glitch. It's not exactly the same. A thing that makes copies of itself is very complicated. You know, it's not a VCR. It's not a refrigerator. It's not even an industrial robot. So if you have a glitch, a random glitch, it's typically going to go to pieces. But once in 1,000 random glitches, you get an improvement. Improvement in what? Improvement in making copies of itself. So it makes better copies of itself, longer lasting, and a wider range of temperatures, and made out of fewer raw materials. Now you have competition between the originals and the new ones. And since the new ones are better at making copies, pretty soon they're going to take over until there's 1 in 1,000 glitches in copying the new ones, and then you get the new ones. That's random variation. I know the word random is difficult. There's 7 different definitions. I'm aware of that. Unguided, unfocused, without any end in view. Accidental. That's the story of how life develops. So you have the record of life plus a causation. Causation is random variations plus selection. That story leaves no place for God. The causation of random variation plus selection means there's nothing else causing it to happen. God is simply left out. Obviously, the Jewish tradition can't buy that. Okay, second question. Could the Jewish tradition make its peace with the facts of evolution? Maybe. Maybe. The Jewish tradition could say that the world looks as if this process is the process that's operating. It looks as if this process is the process that could deliver all of this, the envelope of life. But in fact, God is doing it. God is doing it behind the scenes, where he's covering up his activity and making it look this way. The appearance of random variation plus selection is simply a veil behind which God hides, and it's really God's activity. From our point of view, that's certainly a valid idea, and that being the case, we would have to only disagree with the theory of evolution's description of the cause of how the variations take place, the cause of the development of life. We wouldn't have to take issue with its picture of the stages in which life developed. That's point number one. How are we on that point? Are we together on that point? Okay. Now, as a matter of fact, having made you feel perhaps comfortable, I would point out, I'm not going to do this, I can do this for 3 or 4 hours, but point out that if you analyze evolution and the evidence is offered for it and the arguments are offered for it, they're dreadfully weak, There's lots and lots of counterexamples. And your science teachers are very careful to keep you ignorant and simplistic about this. If you're interested in science in general, and you're interested in evolution in particular, there's one book, I won't say I recommend it, I dare you to read it. It's called Genesis and Genes, written by Yoram Bogac, a South African. It came out 4 months ago. It's a classic, and I guarantee, if you'll read it, you'll never feel the same about science in general, and you'll never feel the same about evolution in particular. Let me give you one little thought, one simple thought. We have the whole expanse of life, and we are told what brought it about is an accidental process. No guiding, no control, no focus, no manipulation to serve an end. It's essentially an accidental process. How should I make up my mind whether to accept a proposition like that? Let me give you a very simple parallel. I have an object, and on one side of this object, I have painted an X. I've thrown the object into the air. I tell you, I threw it into the air randomly, with no control. 3 times in a row, it landed on the X. I didn't throw it any particular way. It's not weighted. It's not magnetized. It has no ridges that catch the airflow. 3 times in a row, it just by accident landed on the X. Do you believe me? Could you believe me? I think I've withheld from you one crucial piece of information. What didn't I tell you? How many faces the object has. Did you assume it was a coin? The probability was 1/8. I didn't tell you it was a coin. Suppose it has 1,000 faces. I painted X on one of them. And I tell you, I threw it into the air 3 times in a row. It landed on the X by accident. I don't think you would believe that. That's a 1 in a billion chance. I mean, that's an American billion, right? 9 zeros. So now, suppose I say, I'm withholding from you the information as to how many faces the object has. What ought to be your reaction to my claim that it landed on the X 3 times in a row by accident? Your reaction ought to be, you haven't given me enough information to make up my mind. You claim it was accidental. I don't have a clue what the probability is that it will happen accidentally. Then I can't make up my mind. Okay, I tell you as a challenge, find somebody who can give you an estimate of the probability that life developed through the procedure that biology describes, that evolutionary biology describes. Find anyone who will give you an estimate of the probability. Francis Crick wrote a book. Now, this is an old book. They believed it in 1981 also. And he said, the probability of life developing on Earth, the way evolution describes, could be exceedingly small, almost a certainty, or any fraction in between. That means it could be close to 0, close to 1, or any fraction in between. We don't have a clue. Thomas Nagel published a book a few months ago with Oxford University Press, and he said, I want to know what evidence is there that the evolutionary story of the development of life has anything but negligible probability of occurring in the whole time span of the Earth. What evidence is there that the probability is more than negligible? There isn't. Well, if they don't have evidence that gives you the probability, then you can't make up your mind whether to accept it or not. It's a point of simple, straightforward logic. Is it important as a research project? Yes. Is it worth investing in? Yes. Is it worth pledging allegiance to? No.
Yes.
The probabilities are extremely small, but we are here, so there is a chance. We're here to observe it, so there is a chance, even though it's so small.
Okay, now I want to take issue with both things that you said. I'm telling you, there's no way to estimate the probability. You're saying the probability is very small. We're not speaking the same language. I'm saying you can't estimate whether it's small or large. I'm saying there's no way to make any estimate at all. You're saying what you're saying because many people in my position take a different line from me. They say, probability is very, very small. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is there's no way to estimate it at all. That's what Crick said. Crick said, probability might be exceedingly small, it might be almost certainty, or any fraction in between. So I'm not starting with that, with the assertion that it's very small. I'm saying we don't know what it is, number one. Number two, you say we're here, so it's possible. That doesn't follow. It doesn't follow that it's possible that that process produced us. It doesn't follow. But let's say it's possible. Everybody grants that it's possible. I don't believe everything that's possible. Do you? Do you believe in leprechauns? Do you believe in the Loch Ness Monster? They're possible, but you don't believe in them. You don't believe in things because they're possible. You believe in things because they're probable. To say that they're probable needs to give me evidence to show what the probability is, or some range of probability that makes it reasonable to accept it as a belief. Right? So being possible, no one says it's impossible. What we say is just isn't nearly enough evidence to say it's true. Yeah.
So does Judaism still stick, but still the idea that we came from Adam and Eve, just two people, and replicated from those two people into the 7 billion we have today in all different races?
Absolutely. Absolutely. By the way, just to give you a sense of the figures, the Torah says that we went down to Egypt with 70, and we left with 2.5 million, let's say. We were there for 210 years. 210 years is 7 generations. We talk about population studies because reproductivity is from about 20 to 40. 7 generations. How many children must each person leave behind to go from 70 to 2.5 million, 7 generations? The answer is 4.6. That's all. And if you tell me the Midrash says that 80% died in Egypt, so it was 12.5 million, all you need is 5.7. It's 5.7 to the 7th power times 70. You can do it on your watch. So when you talk about population increase, it's gigantic over time. So, and there is a Midrash that says they gave birth to 6 at a time. That Midrash is not answering an objection. How could you get so many? A little math shows you how you can get so many. So the idea of the population of the Earth expanding in that way, it's not difficult to explain at all. Yeah.
Fair enough. But then what about genetics? How can you breed an entire population from 2 people?
But your position says that. All evolution believes that. No evolutionary theory thinks that there were more than one jump to humanity. No one preaches that. They all say we came from an original pair. No one thinks there were several different jumps to this species.
But if you breed a man and a woman now and let them have various children, and those children have children, you're bound to get missing chromosomes, inbred children. And
in a certain percentage. You're not bound to come to an extinction of the line. You'll have a certain percentage in which that will happen, and the survivors won't have that problem. I mean, that's what Orthodox evolutionary theory says happened. It doesn't say that the jump to humanity took place in several different places, and from then and then merged.
Scientifically, they say genetically, the human population came from a minimum of 10,000 odd people.
That means today's population is the descendants of those 10,000. Those 10,000 didn't arrive here from Mars.
Yeah, but they came from Adam and Eve.
That's what we say. I'm talking about evolution now. When you say that the current population came from 10,000 people, those 10,000 have to already be the same species. Otherwise, we can't be their descendants. We'd be separated into different non-interbreeding groups. You have to go back to a single pair. Orthodox biology says that as well. Yeah.
So what does Judaism say about the world when it was, now it's split, it was all one piece of land?
Well, the Pangaea Hypothesis, should we say, instead of calling it an established fact. Maybe we should spend a little time on the age of the universe altogether and apply it to that question as well. What about the age of the universe? Last count, 13.8 billion years. It's been going back and forth. I remember when it was 16 billion, and now it's down to 13.8. Okay, a few billion here and there, it doesn't matter. And we're talking about 57, 73. There's some disparity there, as you can tell. How is it that we know anything about billions of years in the past? Well, we see things happening today, like the speed of light propagating through space. And then we project backwards as to what the universe was like in previous stages. Of course, when we project backwards, we are assuming that the processes of nature, the laws of nature, operated in exactly the same way. If they didn't operate in exactly the same way, all our projections are without foundation. We have some reason to think, though it's pretty rickety, some reason to think that certain stars or galaxies are a certain number of light years away. So we know that it's taken that many years for the light to get from there to here, if it's always been traveling at the same speed. If you don't assume that, all bets are off. If the speed is variable, all bets are off. Let me tell you how Maimonides dealt with a problem more severe. In his world, Aristotle was the big gun, and Aristotle says the world has no beginning at all. It goes back infinitely. Indeed, all educated opinion, scientific and philosophical, agree the world has no beginning until 1965. You want me to tell you that story? I can tell you that story as well. But at any rate, how did he deal with it? He gave a parable. Imagine a male baby born, and after he becomes independent of his mother, his father moves to an area where there are only men, no women. Child grows up, and after a while he asks his father, where did we come from? And he's told, there are other creatures like us, but different in certain ways. We all start out as tiny miniatures inside the abdomen of one of those, and after some months we come out, and then we grow into the way you see us. So the child asks, Dad, when we're inside the abdomen of that other, can we breathe? Father says, no. Can we eat? No. Can we drink? No. So the child says, then what you're telling me is impossible. You know very well. If someone doesn't breathe for 4 minutes, he's dead. If he doesn't drink for 3 weeks, he's dead. Doesn't eat for 2 months, he's dead. You're telling me that we're inside the abdomen of those others for months and months without breathing, without eating, without drinking, and we survive? What you're telling me has to be wrong. What is the child doing? The child is taking his world, the world that he sees, the world that he's experiencing, and he's saying, that's the way the world works. And if that's the way the world works, your story has to be wrong. Of course, the truth is that the life of the fetus is utterly different from the life of post-birth, and he's only seen the life of post-birth. Maimonides says, the 6 days of creation are like the gestation of the fetus in the womb. Post the 6 days is like post-birth existence. They operate according to different rules, different causation, different principles, different laws, and therefore any inference from the way organisms behave after birth to how they existed before birth is an incompetent inference. The life in the womb is utterly different from the life afterwards. By the way, it's just a little detail that you can look up, which is quite interesting. Hemoglobin, the molecule that carries oxygen in the blood, changes its chemical structure on birth. The fetus has one molecule of hemoglobin. Post-birth, there's a feedback mechanism which causes the bone marrows that make it to change the structure of the molecule. Because in the fetus, it's got to transfer oxygen from the mother's bloodstream to the child, to the fetus's bloodstream. Outside, it's got to take from the lungs. And there's a more efficient way to do it from the lungs. Imagine someone taking blood from a person and analyzing the hemoglobin molecule and saying, well then, that's the hemoglobin molecule in the fetus. Not so. The quality of life of the fetus is quite different. So the assumption that has to be made for the age of the universe, that the laws of nature have always been the same, is something which is just an assumption. And in fact, Niels Bohr, one of the great physicists of the 20th century, not a religious fanatic, not a creationist, one has to make those apologies, said that projections to the ancient history of the universe are incompetent because the laws of the universe have been evolving just like other parts of the universe have been evolving. The laws have not been constant. So what you see is the estimate of the age of the universe requires a gigantic assumption. That's the constancy of the laws of nature. It's an assumption, and by the way, some are questioning that. I don't know if you know about cosmic inflation, Alan Guth and company, and some are questioning the constancy of the speed of light. Some are questioning the constancy of the fine structure constant. There are some research being done now to show that maybe the laws are not as constant as we think. And that being the case, a position that simply says we don't share your assumption, it's not a position that can be ruled out if the competing position is one that's based on free assumption. We're talking about the age of the universe. How do we know anything about that? How do we get any information about it? How do we get data on which to cogitate and create a position? We are, after all, sitting on this planet. All the information we're getting is from this one point of view. How do we draw conclusions about the universe as a whole? There's a reason. A principle called the Cosmological Principle. And the Cosmological Principle says this: just as the universe looks to us from here, so it would look from anywhere else, pointing in all directions. It's homogeneity and isotropy, if you want the technical terms, together, cosmological principle. Stephen Weinberg, in his wonderful book, The First 3 Minutes, came out in the 70s, First 3 Minutes of the Big Bang, puts this in the preface. Everything in this book depends upon the assumption that what you see here, you would see everywhere else. Okay, what backs up that assumption? Stephen Hawking, you've probably heard of him, in A Brief History of Time, on page 41, writes the following. It might be that the way it looks to us from here is the way it looks everywhere else. It might be. We have no scientific evidence for or against that principle. We believe it, I'm glad you're all sitting down, we believe it on grounds of humility. Humility, little virtue. Because we don't want to believe we're special or different or isolated in any way. So we believe on the basis of humility that the way it looks from here is the way it would look from everywhere else. Without that assumption, you can't draw any conclusions about the age of the universe or anything else about the universe at large. So here you have another gigantic assumption. One of the world's greatest scientists admits that we have no evidence for or against the assumption. Without that assumption, the conclusions can't be drawn. I think it would be permissible for a person to say, you have your discipline, you have your axioms, you have your rules of investigation. Fine, you're paid to do that, deliver the results based on your assumptions. But don't forget the assumptions that you're making. And don't forget that since they are, after all, assumptions, not everybody else has to share your assumption.
Good question. So there's a lot mentioned on the creation at the start of the world. What is mentioned on the end of it? Is there any?
The end of it. Okay, it's a complicated issue. I'll just tell you why I can't really answer you. Maimonides, in the end of his legal work, the Mishnah Torah, says the following. Eschatology, that's the study of the end, is based on verses in the prophets and a few in the Torah itself. The verses are vague and ambiguous, difficult to understand. And then he says crucial words. There's no oral tradition on the subject. So he says the scholars are thrown back on the verses. The verses are vague and ambiguous, and therefore no one knows how it's going to end. There are many different possible scenarios, but they're only possible scenarios, alternative scenarios. Maybe the scenarios will combine in various ways. There's no solid information as to how it's going to end. There are solid predictions in the meantime. If you're worried about being able to falsify, which is a misplaced worry, but after all, it is predicted that we will never disappear. Jewish people will never disappear. If the Jewish people disappeared in total, that would prove the Torah is wrong. So we're making predictions that could be tested, predictions that could indeed be falsified and show that the Torah is wrong. We haven't protected ourselves in that way. Even though the need for falsification is a mistake philosophically, that's another long issue. But, so we do make predictions, but how exactly the end is going to take place, something which we don't have solid information.
Why do you think they chose to make it ambiguous as not to, like, we know?
I'll tell you what someone said, and then he has a question. The Torah talks about consequences of following God's commandments and consequences of violating them. The consequences almost exclusively are this worldly consequences. There are clear scriptural hints at another world, another existence beyond this world, but they're very few. And in the oral tradition in the Talmud, which has 5,400 pages roughly, maybe out of 5,400, 50 deal with matters like that, and all the rest deal with this world. A Jew has to have a split consciousness. He has to think, I'm in this world and only to get to the next world, but everything in the next world depends upon what I do here. So my focus has to be here. There was an article in a magazine called Look magazine in America 100 years ago when I was young. It was written by a Catholic priest. The Catholic priest said, imagine a person in an intersection and he suddenly discovers that a Mack truck is bearing down on him. How likely is he to jump? Now listen, a Catholic priest wrote this. He said, if he's Catholic, he's least likely to jump. If he's Protestant, he's more likely to jump. And if he's Jewish, he's most likely to jump. Why? He meant this as a critique of Catholicism, of which he's a member, and a substantive critique also of the rest of Christianity. He said because Christians are focused on another world, living in a dream world, and they aren't enough focused on this world. A Jew is focused on this world almost exclusively, almost completely. That is what the Torah wants. The Torah wants you to have at the back of your mind a footnote. yes, this world is leading to the next world, and then think, but everything depends upon this world. Imagine doing crucial brain surgery, knowing that if you succeed, you'll be elected to be the greatest brain surgeon in the world. Are you anticipating the prizes or worried about this blood vessel? Worried about this neural connection? You better be worried about the blood vessel and the neural connection, not be thinking about the anticipated prizes. That's why it's not. You had a question?
Assumptions earlier. Mathematics is also based on assumptions, and I can describe pretty much everything based on mathematics. I can describe the wings of a butterfly in geometric patterns, and I can write a formula to describe that geometric pattern.
Well, let's see. Can you describe the successive stages in the development of a fetus to birth in mathematics? Each one, no, let's put it this way. Let me do it this way. You talk about the wings of a butterfly, right? You can describe their shape. You can describe their movement, right? Can you describe the materials that make them up in mathematics?
What do you mean, like the carbon that makes them?
Yeah, in mathematics. Not in chemistry, in mathematics.
Carbon is like based in science, right?
Well, based on, but it can't be described in mathematics. Mathematics won't tell you whether it's carbon or whether it's steel or whether it's plastic or whatever, right? Mathematics applies to everything only because mathematics treats a very superficial level of things. I can count all the things on this table. Mathematics can't tell me that some are books and some are soda cans and some are pencils and some are pieces of paper.
Language. Mathematics is a language.
Mathematics isn't?
It is a language. It is language. You're describing language like books.
Correct. Correct. But mathematics doesn't embrace all of language. It embraces only a tiny sliver of language. Okay, so now what was the point?
His name was, he discovered calculus.
Sorry?
He discovered calculus, this one guy.
Eisenberg. Isaac Newton.
No, it was at the same time as Newton. Another guy related to Newton. They're very competitive. Here's one of the greatest things he ever wanted to do was fuse a language like English with mathematics. So we have a universal language to describe everything.
Excuse me, but there's a difference between describing everything on the one hand and describing everything about everything on the other hand. Let's take this most simple possible example. You can count things. You can count anything you want. You can count concepts, you can count books, you can count butterflies, count molecules, you can count everything that you want. But if all you're going to do is count, you haven't described the difference between a book and a molecule. You just counted them. Counting is very superficial. It gives you the number of items, but it doesn't tell you the identity of items. It doesn't tell you how they interact. It doesn't tell you what they're made of. The fact that a language is universal doesn't mean that it tells you everything. It just means that what little it bothers to tell you applies to everything that there is. That's useful. It's useful, but it doesn't settle all questions. What will mathematics tell you about love?
But if I have a carbon atom, it has a certain amount of neutrons and protons. That's counting it.
But you've got to say it's neutrons and protons, not electrons. And neutrons, electrons, and protons isn't mathematics. That's a description of the physical matter.
Yeah, but when you count them, I can actually see what they're based on. If say
I'm sorry, when you count them, you see what they're based on. If I count this book and this cell phone, do I see what they're based on because they make two?
No, but I'm talking about the formula behind it, not actually counting. Mathematics is more than just counting.
Okay, but I'm using the example of counting to show you that the fact that you can count everything leaves out the vast majority of information we care about the things that we count. Good. So, but mathematics won't tell you the difference between an electron and a neutron. Good, then that's not mathematics. Good. Philosophy of mathematics was my field. My field was philosophy of mathematics. So this is my meat, so to speak. You asked already, right? Yeah.
Can I just bring it back to something else instead of all this evolution? I've always wondered, other religions have the same belief in their God as much as Judaism has belief in their God, which, whether how they go about it is right or wrong, and whatever, even if it's crazy to us, it's right to them. It's like you discussed, scholars in their religion, so we don't understand it. So surely, yes, maybe I'm only Jewish and I only believe in this God because I was born into it, but how can we claim that Judaism's the truth, not other religions are wrong, where for all we know it's the same God, it's just different methods of going about it?
Very, very good question. How do we know that we're right? If there are all these other religions, they all have their beliefs, they all have their scholars. I want you to know, I was born into a non-religious home. I went to college as an atheist. And I'm standing before you this way now because I made my own investigation. And that was my first question. What about all the other religions? So I read them and I investigated them. And I have written about this. I've written about this in summary form, which is available on my website. Anybody needs it in detailed form, you can send me an email and I'll send you the whole investigation. I asked only one question. What reasons do other religions give to think that they're true? That's not the only interesting thing to ask about a religion. Religions perform all sorts of functions. They have all sorts of impact on human life. And I was looking for the truth. I want to know what reasons they give that they're true. The Far Eastern religions give none. That's not their line of business. They don't care whether you think they're true or not. The Far Eastern attitude is you judge a belief on what will happen to the person when he believes it. Will he become a better person? Become a nicer person? Happier person? Was a contented person? Then believe it. Not. Truth doesn't play a role. So I said, that's not in my ballpark. That's not part of what I'm looking for. You talk about Hinduism and Buddhism, the only evidence that they offer is evidence in personal experience. Follow this regimen and you will feel in certain ways. And they're right. You follow their regimens and you do feel the way they predict you're going to feel. But that just means they've learned about human reactions to certain types of regimens. They learned that through experience, through intuition. What does that got to do with whether there's one God or many gods, whether you go through incarnations, whether the world is so many thousands of years old or infinitely old? The fact that I get the feelings that they predict is not evidence for their beliefs in their religious ideas, so it's irrelevant. Christianity and Islam, because they learned from us, do present evidence. The evidence for Islam is twofold. One is, and this is almost all the scholars in Islam write this, if you learn Arabic, well, read the Quran, you'll see right away that only God could have written it. It'll be just obvious to you that only God could have written it. Well, there are counterexamples. There are professors at Cambridge of Islam who know Arabic as well as any Muslim or Indonesian who are Muslims but not Arabs. And they're not convinced. So then they say, well, it's not enough to learn Arabic. You've got to learn Arabic and read it in the right spirit. Okay, what's the right spirit? The spirit that leads you to the conclusion that it's written by God. Okay, but now, of course, it's impossible to test. You just protect it, just like all test, every possible test. Third, you realize it could only be written by God. Why? Because it's so beautiful, so inspiring, so complex, so well crafted, no human being could have written it. I don't know, I feel that way about Shakespeare. Nothing in the last 400 years of English writing comes anywhere near Shakespeare. I don't think a human being could have done that. I'm a musician. The late Beethoven quartets could not possibly have been composed by a human being. The whole of the 19th century was trying to catch up with Beethoven. The first move after Beethoven is Bartók in the 20th century. How could a man dominate a whole century of music by his writing? I don't think that's human. That's got to be beyond human. This is all very naive, isn't it? How would I know? Then they have rapid conquest of North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. You look on a map, the Arabian Peninsula is about as big as Europe. And they conquered that in less than a century. Of course, if you look on a topographical map, you'll see that almost all of it is desert. That means there are very few people living there. Big area, but very few people. Conquering that whole area means conquering the people who lived around the edges and a few oases here and there. Wasn't that difficult? That's proof that only the Muslim God must have been supporting them. And so on. I mean, this is all very naive. Christianity needs more examination because they took more stuff from us. Same thing happened with Christianity. In the end, my investigation showed that there's no religion that has enough evidence to be a contender, to be a strong possibility, probability, other than Judaism. So for me, it ended up Judaism or some secular point of view. And that's where I invested a great deal of issue, as have many of other people. But the question that you're asking is the right question, and my work on the question is available, and I can expand it for you. It's something which I guess you'll have to at least see the work of other people that have done in this area. It's something that has to be settled in a person's mind before he can confidently go forward. You got a question?
Yeah, I was just like thinking what John's here to say. Like, I agree, like you can count like neutrons and atoms and electrons and stuff. Like, I don't know correctly if I'm wrong, but like, do we know now what's at the center of like an electron or a neutron?
That's a gold question. That's a golden question. We know what's at the center of an electron and neutron. Listen to what Bertrand Russell said. If you don't know who he is, look him up on Wikipedia. One of the world's most famous atheists of all time. One of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. and this has been repeated now later, in 1996, in David Chalmers' book. Think of the properties of the elementary particles. They are all properties of interaction, how they interact with one another. Mass, that's inertial mass. That means a resistance to force to produce an acceleration. Charge, that means similar ones of the same category will repel one another, and different ones will attract one another. Spin, that's intrinsic angular momentum. That means that when you have a collision, the colliding body doesn't bounce off straight, it bounces off at an angle, because this has intrinsic angular momentum. All the properties of elementary particles are relational properties, how they interact with other things. So Russell said, then science isn't telling us anything about what they are. It only tells us about how they interact with one another. So what they are is left completely blank, completely blank. Now there's a problem, very serious problem. How do material things think and experience? How does that happen? Many philosophers feel that at the present time, there's not even a hope of an explanation of that. So Russell said, I'll tell you how it works. You know what an electron is? An electron is a thought, a very dull thought. Minus charge, minus charge, minus charge, this mass, this mass, this mass, this spin, this spin, this spin. It's a very dull thought. The universe is populated by thoughts. Then when you put together 14 trillion thoughts, you get something that can think very sophisticated things. That at least gives you a bridge to the answer. But then the world is very different from what it looked like. Just dead stuff. Now, that's called panpsychism. Psyche is everywhere. David Chalmers, one of the leaders in philosophy of mind, wrote a book called The Conscious Mind in 1996, and he picked up this idea. And it is one of the ideas that people discuss today for precisely that reason. Science doesn't tell us anything about what the particles are. It only tells us about what they do when they interact with one another. Yeah?
I recently learned that God does not need praise. So my question is, why do we praise him so much?
Okay. In order to answer this, I have to explain to you what praise is. This is just it's interesting. Even the New York Times got this right, which means that it's actually percolated down to a very low level. When I praise something, that's a great picture, it's a great poem, is that subject or objective? Am I just expressing my feelings about it? Or am I saying something that's objectively true or perhaps false about the item? Everybody will tell you it's subjective. It's a mistake. I'll show you it's a mistake. The difference between subjective and objective is whether you could be wrong. Now imagine that you meet someone, let's say an Australian Aborigine, maybe this isn't true anymore, but it could have been true, who's never heard of basketball. Never heard of basketball, doesn't know what it is. You say to him, if you ever visit me in Sydney, I'll show you something interesting. And he comes. And you say, I'll take you to a basketball game. So you take him to the court, take your places, and the teams are warming up. Suddenly he grabs your sleeve and he says, wow, did you see that? He was in the air. His feet were off the ground, and he threw the ball into that hoop. What a great shot. It was a jump shot from the foul line. You just say, that's not a great shot. High school kids can do that. You know, maybe in the course of the game, you'll see one or two great shots. So when the Aborigine said it's a great shot, he was wrong. It isn't a great shot. Because by definition, great shots aren't common. Great anything aren't common. The common every day isn't great. That means calling it great can be a mistake. That means it isn't just subjective. That's just an expression that I feel overwhelmed or I feel off or that. It's a question about what the thing is. That's step number one. Praising something is expressing my appreciation for its real qualities. It can be worthwhile, regularly, to express my appreciation for the real qualities of God, because that keeps that idea foremost in my mind, and it reinforces the emotions that I have to God, which is something which is worthwhile to do for a religious personality. By the way, it's also worthwhile in marriage. It's also worthwhile in marriage. Time to time, sit down and say, who did I marry? And what is she like? What are her qualities? Not to take her for granted. Then even maybe write her a little note. You know, it's a privilege to be married to somebody who's like XYZ. So she'll know that you're thinking about it, and you'll feel it, and you'll be reinforced in feeling it. Feelings tend to become habitual and deadened with time, like everything else does. And one needs a kind of reinforcement. So praising God is something we do for ourselves, not for Him. Indeed, the Talmud says, from God's point of view, Praising him is like speaking about the vast amounts of silver that someone possesses when he really has gold. How would he feel about that praise? Would he feel satisfied and inspired by the fact that you're talking about his vast holdings of silver when he really has gold? What you would say is, you're not dealing with the reality. Far from it. We can't express the infinite greatness of God, but we can enrich our lives by praising these things, because in that way, we're in touch with the reality of God that we can understand. We can make a praise.
How does Judaism reconcile the idea that there were dinosaurs which were on the earth many years before the creation actually began?
There was what on the earth? Sorry. Dinosaurs. Okay, so now, going back to the age of the universe, if the laws that we talk about start operating at the end of the sixth day, during the 6 days themselves, other laws, or perhaps no laws at all, but just guidance, is what's taking place. One way to explain it, there are really two. People's natural prejudices are in favor of this one, so I'm going to tell you this one. Just letting you know, there's another one that could be discussed in greater length. Written by Rabbi Schwab, is this. Everything that the scientists describe really happened. All of it just happened much faster. Billions of times as fast. You'll tell me that will violate laws of nature? You remember the laws of nature that we have weren't operating then. So, and he says this, of course, it'll violate the laws of nature. So what? So there really were dinosaurs and pterodactyls and all the rest. They're not like griffins and centaurs, which we think of as mythical. And all of it really took place. It just took place much faster and crammed into 6 24-hour days. So you can have the comfort of thinking that they really were there and they really trumpeted on the earth for their milliseconds and then disappeared. Yeah.
Do you think that it's possible to have morality without religion?
Yes. I don't think that religion is necessary for morality. I know I'm contradicting what you may have heard and what you've read in various presentations. I have 16 sources within the Torah tradition itself which indicate human beings know the basics of morality without any divine commandments, without any divine revelation whatsoever. And the idea that religion is necessary, or God's commandments are necessary for morality, is a failed philosophical position. What can I tell you? All the books in which this argument is given, you need religion for morality, have one thing in common. All those chapters have no footnotes. They have no footnotes because there are no Jewish sources which indicate that. And I'll just give you 2 examples. The Talmud classifies different kinds of commandments. One are called mishpatim. A mishpat is a commandment which, if God had not commanded it, we would know that we have to do it. That sounds black and white. Shimon Shkup in the 20th century asked the following question. We know the Torah forbids us from stealing other people's property. Now here are 2 possibilities. Either God says, don't steal A, B, C, D, and E. So, okay, can't steal them. Since God says, don't steal them, that they become thereby someone's property. They're his property because God said, don't steal it. That's one possibility. The other possibility is property is independent. Property stands on its own. And God says, don't steal other people's property. Shimon Shkup says the latter is true. Property is independent. Property comes first. And God says, don't steal other people's property. And then he says, the same relationship is found by a classical statement of the Jewish tradition, and that is, one of the reasons for keeping the commandments is gratitude. Gratitude. God gives me my existence, my energy, my resources, and all of my abilities. I owe him a lot. The fact that I owe him a lot, the fact that I have a debt of gratitude, is a fundamental reason for keeping the commandments. Get the picture. Here are the commandments. I want to know. Why should I pay attention? Why should I have anything to do with it? Answer. You received so much from God. This is what God wants from you. You owe him because of what he invested in you. Therefore, you should keep the commandments. Okay, now the key question. Why must I pay my debts of gratitude? Don't tell me because God commanded it. That's going around in a circle. You've got to be obligated to pay your debts of gratitude before you follow the commandments. That's a reason for following the commandments. So that moral rule, pay your debts of gratitude, has to be independent of God's command. Now that raises an interesting question. How are the rules of morality related to God? Is God now just irrelevant to morality? That's a whole long story. I've lectured about that. It's on my website. I can tell you the answer in one word. I took this from John Stuart Mill. It's not my idea. The rules of morality, which we know prior to God's command, create principles, and those principles apply wherever they apply. And given who God is and how he relates to the world, those principles apply to him as well. Take gratitude. Gratitude means I owe my parents, I owe my teachers, I owe my friends, I owe people who lent me money. I owe them a debt because they benefited me. Okay? The principle of gratitude applies to all of them and also applies to God. Principle of gratitude is independent and prior. And then it says, because God benefited me in such extravagant ways, I have therefore a very big debt of gratitude to him. And it doesn't cancel out the other debts. Debt to the parents is a debt. Debt to teachers is a debt. Debt to God is a very large-scale debt of the same kind. So religion and morality are related, but not because religion enforces morality. It's because morality indicates that God is due certain moral consideration because of the way he relates to the moral rules. But the idea of morality being independent of religion is something which I think is correct. From a Jewish point of view, from a philosophical point of view, I can tell you this. Ethics is a very active science. Very active business. New books are coming out all the time. A classic came out 4 months ago. Derek Parfit put out a book on what matters. 2 volumes, 1,400 pages. I'm on my second time through it now. It's a classic. So it's a real philosophical classic. And he's talking about ethics and what bounds ethics, what the grounds of ethics are. And no one says, but there's no God. So the whole thing is bottle empty without purchase. Because since there's no God, there's no right and wrong, there's no good and evil. No one holds that. So it's simply incorrect. I know how it's used. It's used in these contexts to beat up the atheists. Do you really think the Nazis were wrong? Now, what's he going to say? No, it was okay. What the Nazis did was fine. I have no complaints. Of course not. What the Nazis really did is wrong. Well then, if it's really wrong, got to have God, because otherwise it can't really be wrong. And that's why you beat him up. I can't do that because I know it's not right. Philosophically, it's not right. And I can't use methods that I know are in the end incorrect. So I'm just telling you it's incorrect. And if you get in trouble with other people, report them to me or report me to them. Put us in touch and I'll explain to them why. It's just not correct. Yeah?
Could you please explain your views on the paradox of omnipotence?
Oh, the stone too heavy for God to lift?
Yeah,
okay, I'll do that. I don't know how much time you have. Okay, because this takes just a little warm-up. Omnipotence. God is all-powerful. Sometimes people gloss that God can do anything. Is that really correct? God can do anything? Let's try some examples. Can God learn something new? Do you think? Can God improve? Do you think? Does that sound right? To say that God can learn something new would mean that at present he doesn't know everything. Does that sound right? To say he could improve would mean that at present he isn't perfect. Does that sound right? The idea that God can do anything is simply wrong. It's a wrong idea. No, the Torah isn't committed to it. No religious person is committed to it. No believer in God is committed to it. The truth is, we say God can do anything that a perfect being could do. If there are abilities that depend upon imperfections, of course God doesn't have them because he's not imperfect. He's perfect. That's just to soften up your ideas a little bit, to show you that the naive expression, God could do anything, isn't correct. That's part one. Now I'm moving to another category. Separate category with a different disposition. What about God can or cannot create a square circle? How about that? Try this. God's challenged me to a game of chess. Now, since he's a much better chess player than I am, he's giving me an advantage. He's playing with only his king. Query, can he checkmate me with only his king? I know it would be hard for you. We're talking about God. Can God checkmate me with only his king? Can God divide 2 into 5 evenly with no remainder? Can God correctly spell the English word table with exactly 4 letters? I hope you're beginning to feel uncomfortable. There seems to be something wrong here. Checkmating with only the king? And what about square circle? Now here's the bottom line. When you have the form, God can blank, and you fill in the blank with words, Your first responsibility when you fill them in is to make sense. You're talking. We're discussing. You have an obligation to make sense. Suppose someone asks, can God blah? Blah? What's blah? Blah is nothing. It's just a sound. Can he or can't he? You're religious. You have to say yes. No, I don't. What I say is, you haven't asked the question, because blah isn't a word. Your first responsibility is to make sense when you talk. You want to ask me a question, ask the question in terms that are sensible terms. Now, when he says, can God make a square circle? I have the same response. What? A what? Square circle? I know what square is. I know what circle is. I know well enough to know that when you put them together, you don't get anything. It's just not meaningful. You say square circle, nothing lights up in here. You know, nothing goes on. No ideas come up because square circle isn't meaningful. If you want a resource for this in contemporary philosophy, look at Hilary Putnam. Okay, so now when you put the words in the blank, you've got to put in words that are consistent. Now, here's the first subtle move. Therefore, somebody says, can God create a square circle? The response is, I will not say that he can create it, and I will not say that he cannot create it. I will not say either of them, because either of them is to answer the question. And my position is, you haven't asked the question because you've used meaningless words when you put them in putting in the blank. Okay, finally, can God create a stone too heavy for him to lift? What's the critic's position? Now I gotcha. Watch. If he can create it, he can't lift it. And if he can't create it, then that's what he can't do. Either way, there's something he can't do. So omnipotence, as you say, is paradoxical. That's a mistake. The critic is assuming that I have to respond to his words with a yes answer or a no answer. I choose a third way out. I respond to his words by saying, you haven't succeeded in asking a question, and therefore I don't owe you any answer whatsoever. Because the words you put in the blank, create a stone too heavy for God to lift, are self-contradictory. Why are they self-contradictory? Watch. A stone too heavy for God to lift means stone so heavy that God, who's all-powerful, can't lift it. Stone so heavy that God, who can lift anything, can't lift it. Stone so heavy that God can lift it and can't lift it. And that's a contradiction. So the response to the paradox of omnipotence is, it's not a paradox because the words which are used to express the paradox are not meaningful. And since they're not meaningful, they don't carry any implications whatsoever. That's the long and short of this. Is on my website, written out in all detail. Yeah.
What about omnipresent? If he's everywhere, he can be nowhere.
Well, we would say that he's certainly nowhere. Only physical things can have a physical location. So I don't follow the logic. If something's omnipresent, it can't be anywhere? What does that mean?
Basically, he can do anything, right? God can do anything, but God is omnipresent, meaning he can be everywhere.
Can be or is?
He is. God is everywhere.
Okay.
God is everywhere.
So what's wrong with that?
God is everywhere, but he does not know how to not. He does not know how to not be in a specific place.
He doesn't have his knowledge. You certainly mean that. What sounds to me you're fishing for is God is unlimited. And since God is unlimited, everything that we say must be correct about him, and then you get contradictions. Of course, no one says God is unlimited in that sense. Nobody says that. Indeed, imagine God were unlimited. That means everything you say has to apply to him. Then that would include being limited, right? So his being unlimited would include his being limited. That doesn't sound like a coherent position. This is not a paradox. It's just the premise that you're starting from is a premise that nobody accepts.
And what about him not being in a specific place?
Our view is that only physical things can be in a place. So of course God isn't in any place. He's not a physical thing, so he isn't in any place. God can't be in a place. He's not the sort of thing that could be in a place.
So he's not physical.
Of course not. That's ABC of Judaism. Of course he's not physical. Not a physical thing. All of the physical worlds are created by his will. He's not a physical thing. That's ABCs.